I just got my hands on the largest set of colored pencils that I've ever seen, and I'm gonna create a self-portrait using every last one of these 150 colored pencils. This is pretty much my first time ever working with the Holbein colored pencils, and as I take on this challenge, I'm gonna share with you exactly what it's like to work with these pencils and the Holbein colored pencil blender. I'm also going to show you how I used every last one of these 150 pencils in my drawing, including the neon and the metallic colored pencils, which were a challenge. And of course, I'm going to show you how this all turned out, which was pretty awesome. But first, I bet you're wondering why in the world I would take on this challenge. Well, once I had graduated from art school and stopped receiving assignments on what to draw, I often had a hard time getting my art started. Without the assignment, I had limitless possibilities, and as Austin Kleon points out in his book, Steal Like an Artist, nothing is more paralyzing than this. What's the solution? Create limitations, create constraints, or create a challenge. What really stood out to me first when I opened this box of colored pencils were the amazing range of colors that didn't actually have any serious overlaps. I immediately wanted to create something using every single one of these colored pencils, but I was kind of stumped on the subject matter. I thought maybe I could do a flight of macaws or a beautiful garden, but I didn't really have any photo references for this, so I started looking through photos I had recently taken for some inspiration. And I stumbled across a photo shoot that I had done in a previous video, all on self-portraits. And I thought, what an amazing challenge to do a self-portrait with every single colored pencil. With several great contenders for a photo reference, I ultimately decided to go with this one because it felt like it represented an authentic version of myself, and also because I could inject a bunch of color into this plaid shirt. The very first pencil I used was Sea Fog, and I used this to lay in the proportions of the face so lightly. And then I came in with Cinnamon, which was this warm reddish orange color, and Burnt Sienna, which is a similar color. Both of these pencils are going to incorporate really well into all of the different tones found in the face. Once I got the proportions in, I then started working with my shadow shapes. And at this point in the drawing, I'm really focused on working with as few pencils as possible. I know this is super counterintuitive because ultimately I have to use all 150. But if I am switching pencils way too much in the beginning, it can be really overwhelming, and it can take me out of the process of really focusing on the shapes and the proportion and laying out and getting the drawing started. Finding all these shadow shapes and folds and the pattern in this plaid shirt is very time consuming, but if I do it on the front end here with really basic colors, they're already found. I already know where they are, and that makes future stages of the drawing a lot easier because I'm not looking at proportions and trying to figure everything out. I'm coming in with color, or I'm coming in with temperature or intensity or texture, and that allows me to work with just one concept or just one idea at a time. If you didn't immediately recognize the box or the barrel of these colored pencils, these are the Holbein colored pencils. They are available in single pencils, 12 sets, a 50 set of just the pastel shades, all the way up to the 150 set box. So there's lots of ways to experience these pencils. As I build up a light layer everywhere, I eventually come in with another pass of color, darkening the value. Here I'm using Autumn Leaf and Carmine. Okay, so let's chat about how these pencils might differ from some of the other leading brands. When I picked up these pencils and started laying them in, I used an approach that was really similar to the approach I would use with the Light Fast pencils or the Caran d'Ache Luminance or the Polychromos. And that was just to lay down light coverage areas with sharp pencils all over the paper. They felt similar. They definitely felt like a professional artist grade colored pencil, and I knew that I would be able to do a lot of layering with these pencils, but they did kind of feel a little bit slipperier. That's not a bad thing. It's not like a benefit that makes them better than the other pencils. It's just a slight difference. So they just kind of glided over the paper a little bit easier than any of my other pencils did. They didn't catch the tooth of the paper, and I noticed that that helped them lay down a little bit more pigment. This can negatively impact layering a tiny bit if you end up laying down too much pigment too early, but with a light touch, touch, I thought that these created a really nice base layer background, and I felt that they definitely were in line with all the other major colored pencils that I have used that are professional quality. Now, when I'm working on the shirt, you might have noticed that I'm picking up families of color. That allows me to focus on one area at a time, and I work on these four main colors to develop the shadows, the color, and the stripe patterning and texture. Then when I move to another area, I switch up the colored pencils a little bit so that I'm able to get through as many colored pencils as possible. And I'm doing this strategically, keeping the brightest colored pencils closest to the face and the skin. Holbein also has their very own colored pencil blender, which I tried out on this project, and I anticipated it would be kind of like OMS, but it was nothing like it. I started by dipping my brush right into the bottle, just like I would with OMS, and then began to lightly, slowly work it into an area. And I worked section by section, just like I would in any other project so that I wouldn't transfer color. Right here, this is real time, but now I'm gonna speed it up. The first big difference that I noticed between this and odorless mineral spirits was that there was 0 scent to this whatsoever. Even in an odorless mineral spirits where the scent has been removed, there is still kind of a lingering chemical smell that is there in the air while you're working in a little bit after. But here there was nothing. It was completely odorless. I also noticed that this was like a real legit blender. Odorless mineral spirits works the pigment into the tooth of the paper, but it doesn't really move it around. And this blender was moving it around. I actually started losing a little bit of the texture that I had put into the shirt. And this is not something that would have happened at all with an odorless mineral spirits. That being said, you could strategically use this blender with your Holbein colored pencils to create really smooth blends and gradients, but I just wasn't expecting it, so I didn't set up for this at all. My first impression of this Holbein color pencil blender, or MELTZ, was pretty great, so I decided that I was going to come into the hair and the skin as well, and I laid down a little bit more colored pencil in the hair so that there would be enough to blend, and then I went section by section. Look at how much the shadows in the shoulder are blending. That never ever would have happened with an odorless mineral spirits. It almost turned the pencils into a watercolor colored pencil, and I have no idea what was in this and how this worked, but around this time I started getting really curious, and after I had completed this entire blending process, I looked up the ingredients, and it's actually water-based. Now, this led to a whole host of other problems that I didn't really notice until all the blending was done, but because it was water-based and I was working in these larger sections, my paper started warping and buckling, and this led to a lot of problems later on as I was working with the colored pencils. I was eventually able to fix it, and I'm going to show you how I did that, but this warped paper was super annoying, and it could have been all avoided if I had sampled this first in a large area and realized this. Then I would have taped my paper onto a board or pre-stretched it so that I wouldn't have any problems with warping. And that's definitely what I would recommend if you use this product. Stretch and mount your paper, or use a watercolor block that's already stretched for you. 42 pencils down, 108 left to go. And now I am going to pick up more pencils and start developing the skin. The skin at this point is definitely in its ugly stage. Tell me in the comments if you know exactly what I'm talking about that part in a drawing where you're like, this is not going to turn out well. When you've made enough drawings, you have a sense of confidence and you know what the ugly stage looks like and how to move past it. But right now, I am not excited or impressed with this drawing, but you gotta stick with me. It's gonna look so good at the end. That first layer of color is all about getting the initial impressions and the layout all done. And then when I come in with the second layer of color, this is all about really refining, building up the opacity in the pencil and creating that really nice sheen in the paper. I'm also going to be working on the background and the interaction between the skin, the shirt, the hair, and everything's going to come all together. Even when I'm not doing an epic challenge where I'm using 150 different pencils, I usually use quite a bunch of different colors in the eyes. This is because this is often a focal point in the portrait, so a lot of attention and energy can go here, and there are lots of opportunities to change colors here. Of course, there's the obvious iris, and here for my eyes, I'm using a combination of greens, yellows, blues, but then in the skin around the eyes, this is an area where the temperature changes a lot. Right underneath your eyes, it's usually cooler because those bluer vessels are closer to the surface. And then right around the tear duct and that skin almost touching the eyeball, it's a lot pinker. So I'm jumping between pinks, purples, blues, grays to really create a nice convincing sense of temperature change throughout the eye area. Then as I move to other parts of the face and the skin, I'm using similar colors or the exact same colors that I've used in other parts of the face, and I'm incorporating them into other areas. Yes, I have this challenge to use 150 different pencils, but I am not going to sacrifice good art for this challenge. And one of the ways that I have found to create really good skin tone is to use the consistent colors throughout all the skin. So if I'm using a bright red somewhere, I want to incorporate that somewhere else, and not just randomly, somewhere else where I see a bright red undertone in the skin. In the shadows, I'm using consistent colors. Sometimes, like in this neck area, it gets darker, but I'm still using the same color family, and I have all of those pencils that I've been using for the skin in my fist, and I'm drawing from these same colors over and over and over again. And whenever it's possible to incorporate a new color, I do, but I don't just put it in one spot. I put it in lots of different spots. I make sure that it's in the neck and the shoulder, and then somewhere in the hand, and then also in the face, even if it's just a little bit of a glaze, because that helps to keep everything working together. Here are all of the pencils that I used in the skin tone. Are there any surprises for you? I ended up using the swatching card that came with this set of colored pencils a lot, and I'm not usually one for swatching my colors, but I did find this really helpful in learning the colors, seeing them, and then picking out which color was going to work best. Once I mapped in the shadow shapes of the hair, I looked at all of my colors and I realized I had no plan for getting through all the reds, so I changed the color of my scrunchie, which was originally blue, to red, and this allowed me to work with some of my darker reds, my pinks, and this is something that you can do if you understand how value and color work. So far, I've been mostly working section by section, and after finishing the scrunchie, I moved into working on the hair. But I didn't complete the hair because this is something that I want to complete after the background is laid in so that I can have those little fuzzy flyaway hairs overlapping the background. So I get it to a point where I can see where it's going, but I don't have it all the way completed before I move on to getting the shirt rendered and solidified. What do you think of this drawing so far? I'm about halfway done. I've got 75 more pencils left to go. And if you've liked what you've seen so far and excited to see the rest, be sure to hit the like button. The shirt is really where I start getting super creative with color because this is a solid brown shirt in my photo reference. And because I have a strong background of color theory and I understand how value works, I can get really playful, really experimental, and diverge a lot from my photo reference in a convincing way. And I teach you how to do this in my course, The Color Lab. There's a free color wheel lesson where you can get started with color theory linked down in the video description. It wasn't necessarily my goal for this shirt to read as brown in the final product, but I did want a way to neutralize my colors because I had a ton of really bright colors left to use. So I really leaned into complementary pairs. One complementary pair I used a ton was orange and blue. So I would use orange in some of the brighter parts or the lighter parts of the stripes, and then I would neutralize and contrast this with blue. So I have light blue stripes kind of running through next to the orange. And then I also go over the top with a little bit of a glaze of blue in areas that are a little too intense. I can also use cool grays to do this as well. Cool grays lean towards blue and are a great way to neutralize orange. Another complementary pair that I used a ton were red and green. And just for clarification, complementary pairs are colors that are across from each other on the color wheel. A red and green combo are going to help neutralize each other as well.
And this was a strategy I used a ton in the shadows. I would go in and map out my shadows with a really dark, rich green. And here I used a variety of different greens so that I could really make sure I got to every single pencil in my set. And then I would neutralize these greens with a dark, rich red. Sometimes browns can lean towards red, so that is a great option to use as well. I also use this red-green combo in some of the lighter parts of the shirt too. And throughout the drawing, you'll notice me using a variety of pinks. There were a lot of pinks in this set, which I absolutely loved, but I needed to get through all of them, so I used some pink in the lighter parts. These are all of the pencils that I used in the shirt, and it felt so good to have this done and to be able to move on to the background. But before working on that background, I needed to get rid of the warps. So I cleaned my drawing surface, flipped my drawing over, and then taped it down to my desk. Then I wet the entire back of my drawing and made sure that this was really saturated so that it soaked through and I would be able to re-stretch the paper. I used a hairdryer to speed up the process, and the heat I felt would also help shrink the paper back to its original position. It wasn't perfect, but it did help a lot, and I would 100% recommend this technique for getting out any warps that might show up during the process. However, the very best way to deal with warped and buckling paper is to avoid it. With 93 pencils down, I still have over 50 to get through, and the background is going to be one of my opportunities to use a ton of color. I decided to go with a gradient. Now, there were tons of options. I could have done an abstract background. I could have done fun little doodles, but I went with the gradient because it was going to be a little bit more quiet and subdued, and I wanted that contrast against the colorful, bright shirt. I chose a gradient that went from yellow to green to blue, and I incorporated as many colors as possible, and this is definitely a layering game. So I worked with my yellows and feathered them into the greens, and then I brought the greens over the top of the yellows a bit and went back and forth. This is a slow process and definitely isn't the fastest way to lay in a background, but it can be a really satisfying process and is a very mindful experience because you're not necessarily dialed into looking at a reference photo or doing tons of measuring. It's a very in the moment, in the process sort of activity. And I love creating gradients as a mindful exercise.
I was not really set up to be successful with the Holbein color pencil blender because I didn't have my paper fixed onto a board or stretched. So for the background, I used a solvent I was a lot more familiar with. Eco House Extra Mild Citrus Thinner.
Although the Holbein pencils have their own specially formulated blender, they work just like any other artist grade pencil with the solvent. And this is a slower way of blending the background after my experience with the MELTZ pencil blender, but it was something I'm more familiar with, and it really worked the pencil into the tooth of the paper. I actually really love the MELTZ. I think that would be a fantastic option if you want a more painterly approach that moves really quick, but if you want a lot of control and don't want your colors to mix together, then stick with odorless mineral spirits or another similar solvent. I have a video all about how to use solvent, and I will put it in the video description. So if you're new to that product and approach, I have everything you need to give it a shot. Now, I am coming over the top with a second layer, and I am using a lot more pressure. I'm using some burnishing here where I'm using the side of the pencil to really press. And this is a space where I noticed some pretty significant differences between this pencil and other pencils. It blended really well, but it made a lot of dust. There was dust all over the place, and I was regularly using my wet paper towel to just pull it off so that it wasn't getting mixed in with some of the other colors. I think that I've seen this a little bit with the Caran d'Ache Luminance colored pencils, but I haven't seen this at all with Lightfast or Polychromos because they are a lot harder oil-based pencil. So that was kind of odd to me because this is marketed as an oil-based colored pencil, but as far as crumbliness and like the softness of the pencil, it performed a lot more like the waxy pencils. I used just about every yellow, green, and blue colored pencil that I had left, and I got all the way up to 118 before I dove in to the hair and the finishing details. Toward the end of this drawing, I had a crazy amount of blues that I still needed to use. So I really leaned into this in the hair, and I pulled a bunch of blues into the shirt. Using blues next to those orange areas helped make the orange pop out, and it helped add a little bit more interest and vibrancy to the shadows. I tried really hard to make each color really do a specific job while I was working on this drawing, but every once in a while, I just kind of had to sneak something in there so that I could use everything. As I began to layer the hair, I used the techniques that I usually use with hair. I started with my dark shadow shapes, and I used my mark very strategically to show the texture of the hair. Then when it came to the highlights, I got a little bit more playful, and I leaned into aquas, light blues, and light lavenders to add a lot of richness and depth to the hair. And I think this is something that I am going to bring with me into future pieces. Then with really sharp razor colored pencils, I came in with the wispy texture, and there were wispies in the forehead area and off the ponytail into the background. And I always save these for the very end, making sure that whatever is going to go behind them is really well established. So I did have a pretty large, significant forehead for the majority of this drawing, but now I'm coming in and I'm using those little baby hairs over the top to really integrate what's going on in the hair and what's going on in the face. And these little wispy hairs are actually throughout the entire bun and throughout the entire ponytail. So whenever I've got all the darks established, I come in with a lot of pressure with one of my sharp light value colored pencils, and I just wisp it over the top. These colored pencils did a really good job at laying lights over darks, and that's something that I usually look for with colored pencils, and is honestly something that's a little bit more characteristic of a waxy colored pencil than an oily colored pencil. But these pencils did so great. Holbein colored pencils also work really well right over the top of marker. These pieces feature 3 Holbein colored pencils drawn over the top of a marker base, and were created using the March 2024 premium Sketchbox. I've never used neon colored pencils before, and I'm curious if you ever have. My strategy was just to incorporate these neon colors into any area that I could find in the drawing that would allow them to sit there. So I didn't use them a ton, but they are incorporated a bit. These pencils were rated with the very lowest light fast rating, and that leads me to one more thing I wanted to talk about with these pencils. Compared to some of the other artist grade colored pencils, these are not the most light fast set. There are tons of light fast colors, but there are also a lot of colors that you wouldn't find in any other professional grade set, and they are not light fast. Okay, now here I'm using the metallic colors in the hair. I actually really enjoyed that and will probably do that again. I often don't know what to do with metallic pencils either. Are you ready for the grand reveal?
What do you think of the final drawing? I was really excited with how this turned out, and I especially liked the color combinations that I created in the shirt and the background. And honestly, I wouldn't have come up with these if it hadn't been for this challenge. Here is a full playlist of all of the inspiring art challenges that I've tried up to date, and it is going to continue to be filled with more and more. Go check it out and pick out an art challenge to start today.